Today's video is going to be about foreign policy during the age of imperialism and the rise of a plutocracy in the United States. Foreign policy refers to the actions made by a country with regard to other states or international bodies. These actions vary according to the political and economic agenda of the country of concern. A country's foreign policy can change drastically depending on who the President of the United States is during any given time period. And I'd like to give a few examples of former presidential doctrines. President James Monroe, president from 1817 to 1825, stated that efforts by European nations to colonize or interfere in the Americas, both North and South, would be considered as acts of aggression that demanded a U.S. response. This became known as the Monroe Doctrine. President Harry Truman, president from 1945 to 1953, asserted that the U.S. would support democracy around the world and help states and peoples resist the spread of Soviet communism. President Jimmy Carter, president from 1977 to 1981, warned that the United States would use force to protect the oil of the Persian Gulf region from the Soviet Union. President George W. Bush, president from 2001 to 2009, said that the U.S. would use military force preventively or preemptively against perceived threats to the United States, even if a threat was not immediate, and this became known as the Doctrine of Preemptive War. American imperialism reached its height during the late 19th century under the robber barons or captains of industry, depending on your perspective, who rose to prominence during the Industrial Revolution. Men like J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and Henry Ford built massive fortunes during the late 1800s and early 1900s. After the victory of the North in the American Civil War, the creation of a new business vehicle for American capitalists, the Stockholder Owned Business Corporation, allowed for the rise to power in America of an elite class of the wealthiest 1%. The owners of the stock of the corporations were given immunity from any legal liability for anything that the corporation did, and yet they were entitled at the same time to divide up amongst themselves all the profits made of the corporation. Ultraviris is a Latin term meaning an act beyond the powers. The industrialists established this doctrine in order to protect the profits of the corporation. The Doctrine of Ultraviris means that the board of directors of the corporation were charged with the legal responsibility for placing absolute, exclusive value upon the maximization of profits of the company, so they could generate the maximum amount of profit to be distributed to the owners of the shares of the corporation. They were immunized against any personal liability for any conduct on the part of the corporation itself. The only entity that remained legally liable for any conduct undertaken on behalf of the corporation was, in fact, the corporation itself, and that is, the specific assets that were officially registered as belonging to that corporation. They established subsidiaries of the corporation, delegated resources to them to isolate them so that the motherlode of assets owned by the corporation and stockholders would never be at risk in the event of a lawsuit. This set of business practices began in earnest after the Civil War, so corporations pursued raw self-interest in the maximization of personal profit. The era of imperialism ushered in through the invention of the new vehicle of the Stockholder Owned Business Corporation, the rise of an elite class of individual industrialists such as David Rockefeller, seen here, founder of the Rockefeller dynasty. A quote from David Rockefeller himself is particularly revealing. He said, "For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interest of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and am proud of it. This is J.F.C. Fuller. The rise of the elite class of industrialists such as Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and others led to the establishment of a plutocracy in the United States. This is J.F.C. Fuller, British Army officer and war historian, born 1878 and died 1966. He is best known as the founder of modern armored warfare. Here is what he had to say about the government of Western nations. The government of the Western nations, whether monarchical or republican, had passed into the invisible hands of a plutocracy, international in power and grasp. It was, I venture to suggest, this semi-occult power which pushed the mass of American people into the cauldron of World War I. So do we have any reliable sources that can help us to understand how this plutocracy originated? Carroll Quigley was a noted American historian and polymath who is a person of wide-ranging knowledge of learning, and he was a theorist of the evolution of civilizations. He's best known for his books, The Evolution of Civilizations from 1961 and Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, 1966. He was noted for his teaching work as a professor at Georgetown University, for his academic publications, and for his research on secret societies. Professor Quigley was an insider. He was allowed to examine the papers of what he terms an international Anglophile network, which operates in secret. His book, Tragedy and Hope, was not written for consumption by the general public. He knew very few people would be interested in reading it. His students were required to read it. One of his students at Georgetown University was a young William Jefferson Clinton. Quigley was a mentor to Clinton at Georgetown, and later Bill Clinton often recalled the professor in his speeches, recounting how Quigley influenced his thinking and viewpoints. Tragedy and Hope was enormous. It weighed 8 pounds, was more than 500,000 words long, and filled 1,300 pages plus index. And I have my copy of Tragedy and Hope. As you can see, it's a huge book. It combined elements from Quigley's wide reading in economics, political science, psychology, and anthropology to create a general analysis of human development in nearly every corner of the world. Even the harshest reviews noted how ambitious and interesting the book was, though none could wish it longer. I found the reading of Dr. Quigley's Tragedy and Hope to be a rather tedious experience. However, every once in a while, I would read a passage and think, wow, did he just say that? So I'm going to give a few examples here. About the International Financial Network, Quigley says, there does exist, and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the Round Table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the Communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims, and have for much of my life been close to it and many of its instruments. I have objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, but in general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known. About the American Political Society, Professor Quigley has this to say. The chief problem of American political life for a long time has been how to make the two congressional parties more national and international. The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical, so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy. But probably the most revealing quote from Tragedy and Hope pertains to the International Banking Cartel. Quigley says, "The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. The growth of financial capitalism made possible a centralization of world economic control and use of this power for the direct benefit of financiers and the indirect injury of all other economic groups." And I would speculate that the other economic groups are people like you and I. This is John F. Hyland, mayor of New York City from 1918 to 1925. Listen to what he has to say about what he describes as the invisible government. "The real menace of our republic is this invisible government which, like a giant octopus, sprawls its slimy length over city, state, and nation. Like the octopus of real life, it operates under cover of a self-created screen. At the head of this octopus are the Rockefeller Standard Oil interests and a small group of powerful banking houses, generally referred to as international bankers. The little coterie of powerful international bankers virtually run the United States government for their own selfish purposes. They practically control both political parties." Curtis B. Dall was an American stockbroker, vice presidential candidate, author, and first husband of Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, daughter of Franklin D. Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. Dall wrote a book called My Exploited Father-in-Law, referring to FDR. Here's an interesting quote from that book. "For a long time, I felt that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had developed many thoughts and ideas that were his own to benefit this country, the United States. But he didn't. Most of his thoughts, his political ammunition, as it were carefully manufactured for him in advance by the Council on Foreign Relations, the One World Money Group. Brilliantly, with great gusto, like a fine piece of artillery, he exploded that prepared ammunition in the middle of an unsuspecting target, the American people, and thus paid off and returned his internationalist political support." This is Thomas Lawson, American businessman and author, born 1857 and died 1925. Lawson was known for his efforts to reform the stock market, as well as the fortune he amassed for himself through various stock manipulations. Listen to what he said about the internationalists. "There is a small circle of men who control the world's finance. Each member, before initiation, knows its religion to be reward for friends and the extermination of enemies. Once a man is within the magic circle, punishment for disloyalty is sure and terrible, and in no corner of the earth can he escape it, nor can any power on earth protect him from it." That's all for this episode. Next time I will continue talking about the 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson.